Thank you. All right, so our two speakers are Salen Lucas and Dean Hettenbach. Salen is the interim executive director of the Global Center for Medical Innovation, otherwise known as GCMI. He's also the director of design and development there. He is also a research engineer and lecturer at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Dean Hettenbach is the Georgia MEP project manager for supply chain and manufacturing technology, medtech, strategy, and leadership development. And they'll be able to tell you a little bit more about themselves as well. So right now I'm gonna send it over to Salen to talk a little bit more about GCMI and what they do.
All right, thanks, Megan. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for attending this webinar. So yeah, I've been at GCMI for about 3 years now. Before that, I was in industry for about 18 years, worked all in medical device, product development. I'm a mechanical biomedical engineer, and really just love working at GCMI. It's the best team I've ever gotten to work with. It is such a hardworking, creative, just amazing team to get to work with. So to tell you a little bit more about GCMI, so GCMI was founded as a nonprofit in 2012, and our focus is really on commercializing new medical devices, drug delivery, diagnostics, and biologics. So we're a fee-for-service medical device design and development group. So we do feasibility analysis and prototyping, market analysis, regulatory analysis, intellectual property landscape searches, and all of that kind of work that's needed to de-risk a project and get it ready for investment and pitching to investors. And then once you have capital to put towards a formal product development process, we have a quality management system, and we can generate design history files that are required for FDA submission and approval. We also can be the manufacturer of record, which really puts us in a special category of nonprofit university-based groups. So we have liability insurance and oftentimes help early stage researchers and innovators with first-in-human use and clinical trials. And then being part of Georgia Tech, we do quite a bit of teaching, training, coaching, and workshops on best practices in the industry. And then here at GCMI, we are an incubator for startup companies. So we have office space, workshop, and certified clean rooms that startup companies can rent out. And now I'll hand it off to Dean.
All right. Well, thanks, Salen. First of all, this is, again, Dean Hettenbach. Good morning to everyone. I am part of the Georgia Manufacturing Extension Partnership. And I'm an industrial and systems engineer and have worked in and around manufacturing, including med device and pharma, for a lot of years, probably more than I care to name or remember. But, the Georgia MEP as an organization, if you can advance the slide, Megan, that'd be great. So the Georgia MEP Manufacturing Extension Partnership is, as the slide says, a state and federally funded program, and we're all about advancing manufacturing in Georgia, decreasing costs, increasing your growth, and of course, medical device manufacturers are part of the market that we can serve. We're thrilled to be able to partner with GCMI particularly in helping medical device manufacturers, but we have consultants in all different industry verticals. I work, as Megan said, in medical device and supply chain, but we have others in cybersecurity and lean manufacturing, in Industry 4.0 and multiple other verticals. And the way you engage with us, if you want to advance the slide, Megan, is through our regional managers. Primarily, we have 10 regional managers assigned to 10 different regions across the state. And those regional managers are happy to meet with you virtually or in person to further discuss with you, how you can connect with and engage with the Georgia MEP to assist you in your business and in manufacturing. And Megan, if you want to leave that up for just a second, if you want to scan that QR code up, that QR code will tell you who your regional manufacturer would be. And I'll mention as well at the beginning here, so if you have a question, please feel free to just put it in the chat. We'll monitor those questions as we go through, and at times we'll stop to pause to address those questions, or we may save some for the end. It'll kind of be a mix. So we'll just kind of get started on that. So let's jump in. So we're talking about medical devices. We're talking about medical device manufacturing. So let's start with a really basic question. So I'll throw this to you, Salen. So what do you consider a medical device? You know, as you think about that, you know, there's formal definitions, there's informal, but what do you consider as a med device?
I think that's such a good question to get this discussion started. Because oftentimes I think startup companies can just kind of jump right to, we want to do a medical device, or it is a medical device, but it's good to challenge that assumption right from the very beginning. Because it may not be, or maybe you can go to market not as a medical device initially. It'd be significantly easier and faster and cheaper to get to market not as a medical device, and then gain traction, gain some cash, and then do all the testing necessary to get that medical device claim. I would say, you know, it's best to look at the regulations. So I say go to fda.gov is your best source. So there's so much information on there, and they have a specific portion of their website that answers that question, that very clearly defines what is a medical device. And so their definition is any device that's intended for the use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease in humans or other animals. I think that's really important to note. So if your device is a medical device, it does fit that category, then the next step is that you're going to need to determine the appropriate classification that exists for your product. So then you're going to want to go through, and this is all on their website, that you can search for the product classification. You can search through their product classification database, search for similar devices, because you're going to be hoping that there's a predicate device will make it a lot easier for you. So you can search for similar devices by a device listing type as well.
Well, fantastic. So FDA.gov, that helps guide both, you know, is it a medical device that you're working on, and then what class device. So typically, if all medical devices and medical device manufacturers are going to have to engage with the FDA if they get to that definition, even if it's a class 1 device. So when would you say, what's your experience on when a med device manufacturer should engage with the FDA and start discussions? And then if they do, you know, what's the objective of those discussions, would you say?
I think it's really important to start the process as soon as possible. If you're really unsure about any significant regulatory issue, it is really wise to engage with the FDA right away. But prior to talking with the FDA, it's really, again, I just want to stress the importance of going to the website and really putting in the time to significantly reviewing all the content that they've provided on there, so you go into the conversation well informed. Also, we really suggest to all our clients that they find a regulatory consultant that has direct, relevant experience with the exact device type that you are working on. There are many regulatory consultants around the country, around the world. They're not all created equal. They don't all have the same experience. So it's good to do your due diligence, find one that you really work well with and has the experience and knowledge specifically tied to your type of product. I think it's important to note that the FDA has a process for discussions. So it's called the Q Submission Program, and it outlines the requests for feedback and meetings for medical device submissions. However, it's very important to know you need to be well prepared for these meetings. They are scheduled many weeks or months out in advance, and they don't answer vague questions like, hey, what do you think about our device? Or what should we do? You have to come in with very specific questions, such as we think our device is a class 1 510(k) implant because it compares closely to this predicate device. Do you agree? Or based upon the risk, we think the sample size should be X. Do you agree with this rationale? Something like that will get you a lot farther and will be much more valuable for your time with those meetings. I think it's also really important to note that the FDA has several other programs to try to help expedite the product development process, especially for really new radical breakthrough technologies. So they have this breakthrough designation program, as well as a safer technologies program. Those need to, like for breakthrough, you really have to be there's no predicate device on the market. This is a radically new device. But there are these programs that will give you much more routine conversations with the FDA. And, you know, I've been to several conferences where the FDA leadership has spoke at, and I know that they are really committed to improving the speed at which new products are developed. So they have put these programs in place and these policies to really help make it easier for innovators to collaborate and work with the FDA.
So great. So part of what Saylan's saying is you've got to be specific. You're going to come into these meetings, engage with a regulatory consultant, but you have to be prepared and you have to know what questions to ask. Part of being specific is around what you submit to the FDA about your specific product. So as you think about those submittals that you've seen, as someone's gone down the path of talking to the FDA, what would you say are some of the common mistakes around those submittals and claims for those products?
Yeah, ensuring that you've really put a lot of thought into your claims language is absolutely critical. Oftentimes, we have clients that want to have too advanced of claims or too powerful of claims for their go-to-market Gen 1 device. So, for example, instead of claiming that your new sensor can provide a diagnosis based on AI, we suggest to clients back up a little bit, and it's faster and easier to get to market with a easier claim of just saying, we are just collecting data. And the user can then interpret that data on their own. So you don't have to go through the added steps of proving that you can implement your new AI algorithm and that it's diagnosing properly. Start with the easier claim first. Then as you can get more experience on the market, generate more cash, then you can do those more expensive studies to get the more stronger claim. Similar to that would be from on the testing perspective. So shelf life is a claim that's on your label. And so oftentimes hospitals want you to get to a 2 or 3 year shelf life claim. However, that takes a lot more time in product development, as you have to do accelerated aging, environmental conditioning, and transit testing. And so I've seen startup companies that start with just a 6-month shelf life to get to market, start generating cash. Then you can go back and do the longer 2 or 3 year shelf life study. And same with the initial claim for how long the product may be used in interaction with the patient. Instead of going directly to the permanent long-term implant or usage, start with, see if you can identify a part of the market that may be interested in just a 30-day usage. That will be a lot less time consuming and costly on your testing front to show that you can do fatigue testing and reliability for 30-day use versus many months or many years of testing. I think overall, the big pitfall to avoid is not being strategic enough about the claims up front. So it's really important to get the marketing team, the business team, talking with regulatory and engineering to really understand the trade-offs, because oftentimes you want the really powerful claim that you're going to be able to easily sell users on. However, there's a trade-off. There's so much time and energy and money required to do those large human clinical trials or animal testing to get those claims. So how can you get to market with easier to obtain claims that may not be as easy to sell with, but will be easier to get to market with?
Well, I was saying, you mentioned marketing in your previous remarks and around product claims, and we've seen this, and I know you have as well at GCMI. Say a new company has a pitch deck. The pitch deck will talk about the product and the schedule for release and the estimated costs and revenue, et cetera. Or if it's an existing company, it might be a business plan that has similar information around that given product, estimated revenue, schedule for release, that type of thing. So while we've seen all these and we've looked at these pitch decks and looked at these business plans, what have you seen in terms of, just missteps there in putting together those schedules and cost estimates, et cetera?
I think what I most often see is really unrealistic schedules. Oftentimes based upon a big trade show or a conference or sales event that could be 1 year away. And so it's, hey, let's just try to back into that and we'll just try to make it work. I think generally entrepreneurs and engineers are often over optimistic and overconfident in their abilities and think that it's going to work the first time. And from many years in the industry, I can guarantee you that every new product has some kind of unforeseen delay. It could be a failure of a test. It could be a delay in getting your raw materials. There's so many things that happen along the way. It's such a long process. So I really strongly push for, when you first go through your first estimate, you probably need to double your time and probably double your money because there are going to be unforeseen problems along the way. I think underestimating the number of iterations that's going to take. Oftentimes it's thinking that it's going to be great on the first one or maybe the first 2 or 3. But again, from my experience, you always end up with a better design when you've gone through multiple iterations and you've shown it to more and more people, get more feedback, refine the design, and do that as many times as you can. And that's just to get the design freeze. But then to get to actually scaling up your product, there's a big difference between going from making 1 prototype or 5 to scaling up to what's necessary for formal product development of making hundreds or 1,000 of your part, and then the iterations that's required with a manufacturer to make it manufacturable. The first time that you think you've made a manufacturable design and you try to make a lot of parts, you will learn things no matter what of tweaks to design that are required in order to make it more manufacturable. So just really, including all those iterations in can be tough for project managers. Oftentimes there's a lot of pushback from management or investors that are you sure it's really going to take that much time? Why are you putting in this fluff? It's not fluff. It's being realistic. Realistically, there's going to be issues and delays that come up. There's a reason why it's never been done before, and it's hard to come up with brand new items. And so it's good to be realistic that there's going to be some problems along the way. And then really trying to be strategic about it and making sure that you have a backup plan for what happens if we fail this testing, and putting that into the timeline as well. And just talking about and making sure that your management, your investors are aware of these risks. On the cost side, I think oftentimes I see some really, really optimistic COGS targets where it'll be really, really low to make investors think that it looks more favorable. I understand that, but it is really important to be realistic. Oftentimes I see clients forget about final assembly or packaging, labeling, and inspection. There's oftentimes, especially for medical devices, a lot of inspection that's required in process and final inspection. And putting in a proper amount of hourly cost and overhead really can sometimes add significantly to the COGS estimates that are shown in early pitch decks.
Well, we've seen multiple times on our end, the question come up, how do we crash the schedule? How do we make it faster? What steps can we take out? And it's not always advantageous in the long run to do that, as Salem mentioned. And on the COGS side, I'd say we've seen that similarly the common mistake is just grossly underestimating the true cost of the components, procuring them, making sure they're right, they meet spec, etc. Well, Salen, you mentioned, testing. Don't assume that it's going to work. There's some test failures along the way and iterations. That brings to mind quality and quality of production. But quality has different meanings to different folks. Sometimes when you think about medical devices, sometimes it's around certifications or approaches. There's the FDA 21, the CFR, there's ISO 13485, there's CGMP, there's device history record. So you have these certifications and approaches, and as well as just the quality management system in general. So what's really preferred there, and what would your input be in terms of where someone should focus along all of those different processes?
Yeah, and it is a lot of acronyms, that's for sure. It really depends on where you plan to go to market. I assume this audience is mostly thinking about a US market. And so clearly you have to know the FDA 21 CFR Part 820 regulations. However, the ISO international standard 13485 is required for Europe and the rest of the world. And also just recently, the FDA determined that when taken in totality, substantially, they are similar, really. I mean, the 21 CFR 820 and ISO 1345 are basically the same. And so it's important to understand those regulations. I encourage everyone to read through them. We'll go through a brief overview of what they are. But really, what both of those are is requiring a quality management system. And so it's ensuring that you have this well-documented system that clarifies the roles and responsibilities of everybody at the organization, and that you're going through in a systematic approach to say, what are we designing? What is the true market need? What's the user need? Cascading those into formal design input requirements, and then designing your device and having documented drawings, CAD files, specifications of what is the design that you're going to market with. And then statistically significant design verification and validation testing that proves to the FDA with data that your design meets those design input requirements and the user needs. And then when you start talking about CGMP, the current good manufacturing practices, that's really tied within those regulations. And so after what I had talked about was really creating a design history file. And that's what you submit to the FDA. But once you now have then entered into manufacturing, you need to make sure that you have all of the documentation that's showing what you're making, what it was made with, the raw materials, who made it, how it was inspected, all of those records, so that when something goes wrong in the field, you can easily segment out which lot of product had problems. Is there a recall necessary? How are you going to address this? All of that is what makes up a quality management system. I'm sorry, did you have a follow-up question to that one? Was that a second part to that?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I was going to do that. I think part of it, one of the questions we get off and on is, someone's just starting down this path. Maybe they've already talked to the FDA, as we said earlier, but can they do what they need to do from a quality management system perspective, or even from an FDA perspective, with a completely manual paper-based system? Is that doable? And have you seen that?
Yes, definitely. And actually at GCMI, we do that. So we have a really simple, customizable quality management system that's based on Word documents and Excel spreadsheets. And then we actually send ours through DocuSign for approvals. But I know many companies, small startup companies that all sit within one area. It's really easy to just print out the documents and sign it and keep it completely physical. and also as we do it, as keeping it digital, but really a kind of simple paper-based system. However, I've worked inside of large med device companies that have shifted to customized, advanced software systems that track all of that, and it's amazing, but it's costly. And so I advise startup companies that are cash strapped that it's okay to start with that simple paper-based manual system. But as you start generating cash, it's important to invest in your company. And if you are headed to having multiple different products, it does start to get overwhelming just doing a paper-based system. And eventually, as you mature in a company, it really becomes helpful to pay the money to get a customized, really advanced QMS system.
All right. Well, as we talk about, developing, say, a device history file or, working on assembly instructions for a product, one of the things you have to look at is what are you actually working on? And we get questions on and off about the actual prototypes that are being made typically at that stage in the product's commercialization life cycle. As you think about the prototypes that folks have made and ones that you've been involved with, what are some of the pitfalls you see there that, just repeat again and again in terms of the production of those prototypes, and then maybe even use of those prototypes in the testing itself?
I think what we most commonly get is the entrepreneur innovator that wants to jump right to the flashy, polished prototype, thinking that is going to be what gets the investor to invest in their company. And that is important. But oftentimes, many more earlier stage proof of concept, just quick and dirty prototypes are necessary. So it's really important up front in the process to define what is the purpose of each prototype. And you need to, initially prove out your fundamental mode of action before you start, spending lots of money on these really flashy prototypes. So we oftentimes, tell clients to kind of slow down at the beginning, do your homework up front and really be wise about how you're spending your money to get, the end result of what you want out of each prototype and build up to the really shiny prototype later in the feasibility stage. I also oftentimes see innovators really underestimating the number of prototypes required, thinking that really I just need one to begin with, then maybe 5 to test, and then we'll be ready to go to market. But medical device really requires many more prototypes. And as I said earlier, in my experience, the more iterations that you get and the more times that you get a prototype and you show it to different user types, you'll get really valuable feedback. And you don't want to just jump right to design freeze and start spending your money on expensive tooling before you've gotten that feedback. So I really encourage innovators to anticipate making many prototypes before they get to the readiness for the next stage in product development. I also think it's really important to note that prototypes cannot be used for official design verification testing. So what the FDA requires is that you have test articles that are equivalent to final manufacturing methods. So you cannot use just quick and dirty 3D printed parts if you're planning on going to market with a injection molded process. So the prototypes are really good for generating the initial function testing, really understanding really early on usability of the device. But when you're ready to go into formal product development and freeze the design, you have to be talking with manufacturers and you have to be at a much higher volume of parts to be getting yourself ready for formal design verification, validation testing. So nowadays, most products require a minimum of 30 parts for each of your tests. Typically, you need to do like a accelerated aging on your parts as well as T0. So usually has to be at least 2 groups of 30, but oftentimes we'll see 4 or 6 or 8 groups of 30 components, and that's for a medium to low risk device. If you're talking about a really high risk class 2 or class 3 device, you may be talking about a sample size of 60, upwards of 300 devices for each batch of tests. So that's why it's really important to understand kind of the difference between prototyping and test articles.
Well, great. Well, I know one thing we have seen with clients and work with them on as they work through prototypes is they'll typically come to us with a bill of materials for their given product, which at that point still could be in the prototype stage. As you think of those bills of material that you've seen for products, what do you typically find is missing? What's been left out or overlooked, commonly as you think through those bills of material?
I think what I most often see is the packaging and labeling is left off. I know it can seem like a really trivial thing. The most difficult thing is coming up with the design of the product, and we'll just put it in a bag or put it in a box and throw a label on it. And if you don't consider that from the very beginning, it can lead to really significant delays later in the project. And there is quite a bit of cost associated with really nice packaging. We've all, I think, become used to beautiful packaging from Apple products and other consumer electronics. But there is a lot of effort put into those packaging. And so even if you're going with a simple package, it can still be pretty costly, especially considering your devices need to go through transit simulation, which requires significant drop testing, the shake, rattle, roll. And so oftentimes, if you don't put in enough thought into your package up front, you can fail one of those tests. If it's a sterile product, after drop testing, you find out that you didn't have enough protection for your product. It broke through the side of the packaging. And now you're gonna have to start over, come up with a new package. And then at that point, it can be very time consuming because you've probably had to do accelerated aging, which could take you a month to 6 weeks of just sitting and waiting. And then all the environmental conditioning and transit simulation. So you're talking many times months of loss of time. And as a startup company, if you have now many people on staff and you're burning through cash with all those salaries, that can be a really tough spot for startup companies. But really back to the original point of the question of just from the COGS perspective or the bill of materials, if you are forgetting about that entirely, your number could be really low if you're not including the packaging. And then labeling, yes, just the act of the label itself, or the material of the label is not much, but you have to have somebody inspect it. The number one recall has to do with labeling. So labels are not just a trivial thing. Oftentimes, if you don't put enough effort into it, you'll have all kinds of mistakes on your labels and then have to recall all your product, and it'll be so costly. I also oftentimes see just the level of detail put into the quality specifications for each component is not there. So really have to be diving into all the details to make sure that you've really clearly specified what is an acceptable product or raw material or component feature and what isn't. And so going along with that, oftentimes I see companies setting their tolerances way too tight. And so, if you ask a manufacturer sometimes, how tight can you hold this specific feature? They want to show off and they'll tell you we can hold it plus or minus a thousandth of an inch. But just because they can do that doesn't mean you should be setting that tightly. And what I tell clients is that you should really be thinking to yourself, in the future, once you've launched the product and you get 1,000 of these components in, or 10,000 of these components in, because you're wanting high volume, you want to drive down costs, and now you get a whole batch and they're all out by 1,000th of an inch. Are you going to delay your product? Are you going to scrap all of those or send them back and be waiting for products to be returned to you? Or are you going to open the spec and be like, well, it didn't need to be that tight, and then just try to justify your way out of it? The FDA does not like to see that. And so what's really a better best practice is to, from the very beginning, really challenge yourself, challenge your team to what is the widest that you can make a tolerance. And so that if that situation occurs, you know, I'm not going to accept it. I can't accept it, and I'm going to have to send the parts back. But I've made it so wide that you know you with confidence that you're going to be getting good parts from your suppliers.
Well, one I'd add to that we've seen as well is a lack of, or missing, is assembly requirements and maybe even assembly fixtures. It's common for a bill of material to come through and someone will say, well, this is a sub-assembly, or this is how we make it in the lab, or this is even how we made the prototype. But that doesn't necessarily mean that someone else is going to understand how it needs to go together, or once it's together, how it needs to be tested, maybe as an assembly, maybe as a final assembly. So if we talk
going
about
along with that, oftentimes if you're doing it as a startup team, or as a researcher, you can kind of write off your hours and all the hours you put into it, and you've made the 1 or 2 or 5, you've made that work. But going to manufacturing, and now you're going to have to make 200 of those. Yes, the assembly fixtures become extremely important so that you can quickly crank through making many of those assemblies.
Well, as we talk about assemblies and producing 200, 2000, we're talking about scale and, scaling that production. So as you think about the clients you've worked with, what's your experience on when they should get product input from a manufacturer or from, someone who's worked in manufacturing? When should they start seeking that input and or even start discussions with potential manufacturers?
I think it's really important to start right from the beginning. Probably not as crucial in the really early stages of feasibility, when you're really focused on just the prototype and the functionality and your proof of concept. But we include that as part of the initial feasibility, what we call phase 0 planning, to start discussing it. But in phase 1 of a formal product development, design history file creation, our SOPs call for a manufacturing plan. And so, it kind of depends on the maturity of your device. But I think it's extremely important to start having those conversations as early as you really possibly can. And so in phase 1 to phase 2, once you have your design, definitely not finalized, but it's really starting to coalesce. You want to start going out and talking to manufacturers and really understanding the different ways that you can mass produce your part, because it will end up being a significant difference in your design of making a design for a prototype that's 3D printed versus making a design that's for injection molding or extrusion, mass production methods. I think it's really important also to know that it's not just finding a singular manufacturer, but oftentimes it's knowing that you're going to have to be looking for the raw materials, the different components along the way, and then a final assembler, manufacturer of record. And so it's not just one single manufacturer, but it's really the whole supply chain that you need to be putting a plan together for. And going along with that, it's really making sure that you've, as we've learned from COVID, having backup suppliers is really important. If you have a critical component in your process, in your design, and you have just a single source for that, that is a really risky position to be in. And so it's worth the effort to go out and find backup suppliers early in the process.
Well, I'll just note that if you go back to the bill of material comments that we were making, it's not uncommon that we've seen a spreadsheet. Here's our bill of material, and across that spreadsheet of however many components, there's a couple of different potential suppliers identified, potentially that could provide that. But really, as Salen said, it's about designing your supply chain for that product. What is your supply chain strategy for that product, which goes from raw material all the way to the end customer and includes all the different, pieces in between, which is a very different approach than just highlighting a few suppliers that might be able to provide, a given component or multiple components. Well, as we think of all we've gone through today, Salen, let me ask you, what have we missed? Is there anything key that just is on your mind that says, okay, here's one thing I would really want everybody to remember that we maybe haven't covered thus far today?
One that oftentimes comes up is biocompatibility. And I just want to stress to everybody that just because another product uses the same material that you plan to use, especially if it's a plastic material, it is very difficult to justify that with the FDA. And it's really easy for the FDA to require that kind of check the box exercise. And it's not just the FDA being difficult. There's a real reason for this. And it really has to do with leachables and additives that are commonly used in injection molding or extrusion. And that's what the FDA is worried about. And so, yes, the raw material may be biocompatible, but until you have actually gone through your process, and that's why they say the final design, verification, validation products have to be equivalent to final manufacturing. That's what they're worried about. So you have to go through that whole process, get all those parts, send those off for biocompatibility testing in order to prove to the FDA that your process, along with the material, is biocompatible.
One thing I know Salen and I have talked about as well as we work together with different clients is that it's really hard to go backward and kind of redo your regulatory pathway or your quality system or even some components of your design. So as you think about those schedules, while it may be tempting in a lot of cases to take your proof of concept and try and jump over multiple other milestones and get through the process faster, it doesn't always benefit you in the end. If you have to regroup and restart, it could take much longer than what you had initially anticipated.
I agree 100%. And that makes me think, oftentimes I get the attitude from innovators that, how can we cut corners? How can we, not do all of this stuff that the FDA is requiring of me? And I now, after going through all this, going to business school, I'd like to point out that even if your device is not a medical device or is a class 1 exempt device, most of what is in the regulations is just simply best practices for running a good business. And so if you want to produce a quality product that your customers are going to love, then you need to be making sure that you're clearly defining your user inputs and your design, and making sure that you have specifications for your raw materials. Everything that's put in place is really best practices for creating a great business and creating a good quality product for your users.
Well put. And of course, the Georgia MEP and GCMI, can help you with, manufacturing, with understanding how that has to happen. We were just talking about scale and how to move that forward, as well as Salen mentioned earlier, all the different phases across the commercialization process, which are so critical to getting your product to market. Well, I know we have some questions in the chat and maybe a hand raise. Megan, you want to jump into some of those?
Yes. So I see we have one question from Greg Jungles. So are there any programs available for startup founders to take advantage of to make engagements with GCMI and or Georgia MEP more affordable?
You want to take that, Salem? You want me to start? I mean, I guess part of what I would answer is the short answer is yes. And then the follow-on answer is it depends. And the reason for that is typically making it more affordable, means it has to be subsidized in some way, shape, or form. And that subsidy typically comes from a grant or other, type of, funding that you might not otherwise have. And those kind of come and go. So we operate under different grants at all different times, and we can help clients connect to those. So my bigger answer is, as you reach out to us, that landscape changes, but we can certainly provide that input based on kind of how things are at the time and when you need the assistance.
Yeah, and adding to that, I mean, we're a fee-for-service group, so we don't specifically have it ourselves, but we help our clients with STTR, SBIR grants. There's many different grants throughout the state and the country that companies can be eligible for, and so we help them oftentimes with those specific deliverables that need to plug into those grants to help with funding.
Hey,
And then I see the next question is about
yes.
biocompatibility. So I'm not saying that has to be done all the time. I think in the end, with everything with FDA, it's always a risk-based decision. So if you're saying, if you have new or more tools, if you can justify that the same mold material, and if you're using any releasing agents or anything, it's all the same, then you can probably justify not having to do that. But if you're using a fundamentally new chemical, new material for your mold or tooling, then you need to talk about it with your regulatory consultant and possibly ask the FDA. And then, but it really, ends up becoming a business, a risk-based decision as to if it's necessary or not.
Well, all right. And then the person who raised their hand, so they would like to know the difficulties of product designers when it comes to following regulatory requirements. I think it would be time consuming going back and forth between our design and quality and difficult to integrate validation every time. Do companies expect designers to have complete knowledge of regulatory requirements? I know there is quality assurance team, but I think they should also know the difficulties of designing when verifying, right?
There's a lot of questions there. Yes, it can be a time consuming. I think, with experience, you really just fundamentally know the regulatory requirements. So our team has just a lot of experience in industry and knowing these regulations. However, we're not regulatory consultants, and that's why I say every time we strongly suggest that our clients get specific regulatory consultants for their projects. When it comes to validation, validation's really at the end of the process. So after you freeze the design, you'll do benchtop verification, and then go to validating the design and then also validating the process. It is very time consuming and very expensive. And so that's why it's really helpful to have experienced engineers and designers that can help you kind of foresee the potential problems you may have with how you may have worded a specific design input requirement. That when it comes time to validate that requirement, depending on the way you worded it, it might be easier or more difficult. So if you have an experienced team that has gone through just validating a design, that can help you avoid, making that more and more difficult, or maybe not even able to pass your validation the first time through.
One thing that we've seen is it's not uncommon, particularly for more of a entrepreneurial or company or innovator, to hire third parties to do basic design work. And it may be the case that third party doesn't necessarily have the medical device background or knowledge of some of the requirements. But then if that's true, then someone in-house needs to have that kind of background or experience, maybe coupled with a regulatory advisor, as Salen was referring to, so that you can kind of be the gatekeeper before that design becomes finalized of, is it really meeting all the specifications, user requirements, et cetera. Because even if you don't have a design team that necessarily has all that experience or even contract with one, someone has to be mindful of, as the design process progresses, is it progressing along the right path from a regulatory standpoint, usability and user requirements?
All right. Again, reminder, if you have a question, please feel free to use the chat box. No more questions at this moment. We'll give it a minute or so in case anyone's writing a new question. All right, I just got a follow-up statement. Thanks for clarifying that. I read somewhere validation is, did we build the right device? And verification is, did we build the device in the right way? Simple definition compared to ISO and FDA's definition.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That is how we think of it. And again, we do the verification first on the benchtop, and then validation is going to the user and validating that you've actually made the right device. So I agree with that all the way.
Okay, and we just got another question. What are some strategies you use to scale up production of the final functional prototype?
I would say there's no one answer to that. It is highly dependent on the product, its components, et cetera. But a couple of points I'll make, and then of course Salen will weigh in as well, is sometimes when you have to define what scale means. It could be something very different in the first, say, 2 years of commercialization of your product than maybe years 3 through 5. I've seen enough pitch decks and business plans that show, big chunk of revenue coming in by year 4 from a very high volume. But in most cases, you're not going to get there overnight. So maybe you have to have a different strategy for year 1 and 2. And maybe it's around a smaller claim for the product, even as Salen mentioned earlier. And then you kind of advance into, larger scale. The other component of that would be, as you think about scaling up, if you've got the right components, bill of material, et cetera, and you've engaged, correctly across that process, then, some of the points we made earlier, those are really the key to build the foundation to achieve that scale. And normally that, you'll have to make a decision at some point. Are you producing this? Is someone else producing this? But that's just the first decision. Behind it is, who ships the orders, who takes the returns, who puts it together. I mean, so it starts with that kind of simple, more strategy or strategic question, but then that quickly morphs into the detail underneath that. So I'll turn it over to you, Salen, for further input.
Yeah, I agree with that all the way. And I'll give a specific example for injection molding. We really like to use proto labs, proto molds. Those can get you several thousand shots of parts. And I was part of a startup company many years ago that went to market with prototype molding. Once you go beyond the suggested amount of shots, though, you do start to have a higher need for inspection. You'll start to have more parts out of spec. So it can only take you so far, but that is a strategy to scale up from your initial prototype to your first 1,000 or so pieces. Because those molds may be in the $5,000 to $10,000 range, versus when you go to a multi-cavity high volume injection molding tool, could be 25,000 or 50,000. I mean, I've seen some that are 300,000. So depending on the complexity, you can really need a lot of cash to really ramp up your production.
Okay, thank you. And then we got another question. Please discuss how you find a regulatory consultant. Sorry if I missed that earlier.
Well, I mean, we already have an established network, so it's a little easier for us now. But I mean, the way we went through that was many years of searching. So a lot of web searching, and then we also go to a variety of different trade shows, and then also just networking. So we can help you with that. And I mean, there's lots of information that you can search the web for.
Okay. All right. So if you are interested in connecting with either Georgia MEP or GCMI, we have some QR codes. You can subscribe to our monthly newsletter, so you only get that once a month. We won't spam you. You can also follow us on LinkedIn, and we've got a QR code for Dean's contact information as well as Salen's contact information. So if you have your phone handy, you can just open up your camera, scan these QR codes, and either, subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on LinkedIn, or save Dean or Salen's contact information in your phone. So I'll just leave this up here for a little bit so you all can scan the codes. And other than that, we thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you again to Dean and Salen for sharing their expertise. And as a reminder, this is recorded. So yes, we will have a recording available for you all, and you will receive a follow-up information that will once again include Dean and Salen's contact information. All right, yes. Thank you. All right. And if nobody else has any additional comments or questions, I believe we can go ahead and end it for today.
Thank you all very much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.